In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada, for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin, and then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin, and so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something, and so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine and the adults. They were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out. But the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried, because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other, and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes, right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around, thinking we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set, and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just gonna sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range, and she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the third day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge and some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge, down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to the swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl. And once again, there's nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints, because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so, initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. What killed her? But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn, and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased, because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes, and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals, but Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located, and so they followed the drag line into this meadow, and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. An investigator said it looked like something big had been laying, and they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards, animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with 2 theories that didn't really make any sense. These prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off, and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture, despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. 1, that this giant person even existed, and 2, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans. So that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. Did